And now what's coming out in elite sort of sport is the idea of fatigue resistance. I actually called that the fatigue rate more than 25 years ago. Finally, they're starting to figure this out, right? That our ability to also resist fatigue over time is actually a hugely important part of a lot of endurance sports. And we have to specifically train for that. So we typically build a platform of that, but then fairly soon we start adding in multiple intensities that target what we'd call the limiters to your performance. Right, your VO2 max is a limiter because it represents a limit in your ability to provide oxygen. Your lactate threshold, first and second lactate thresholds are limiters, right? Your muscle strength is a limiter. The peak muscle power you can achieve is a limiter. Your ability to store glycogen is a limiter. So we create training to overcome those limiters. This is the basic model of training that we've been using in this country since we figured out that the Eastern Europeans and the Russians and the Germans knew more than us. We started figuring out what they were doing and realized we need to take that approach, right? Now that's all been obscured because, of course, we know what happened in Germany. You know, the East Germans were long using roids, and we always knew that in swimming, right? It was very apparent. And the Russians, of course, have also been using anaerobic steroids forever, as well as all kinds of other. So, you know, what's happened there is people have sort of lost sight of the fact that they're also training more intelligently. They weren't just using, ergogenics, they were also training very intelligent. But now that's come into our world. Like you talk to me in the gym about periodizing. Nobody's even that all came out of the Olympic sport, and now we start to see it in more things in the United States. The biggest and most important part of periodization is not the idea of just cycling. It's the idea of what I call complex training, that you hit all the limiters, different training intensities you need to create the best overall effect. So let's say you're a guy who, a typical recreational runner, he's running 5Ks, he runs them like once every couple of weeks, and the rest of the time he runs 3 or 4 days a week and just goes out and runs, right? So how does he run? Well, he's a guy, right? So he's got to, try to hurt himself, try to beat whoever's running with him. So he goes out and runs vaguely hard, right? He doesn't really run slow and easy because that would be wussy. And he doesn't run all out because he doesn't know how to do that. He runs vaguely hard, right? And if one of his buddies comes out with him, they vaguely hard each other until one of them gives up, right? It's males trying to compete with each other. So, those guys improve at first just by running a little bit more, but before you know it, they can't get any better, right? So let's say you take that guy, maybe he's doing 15 miles a week. And all you do is say, okay, let's take one of these runs and let's slow it way down and let's gradually increase how long it is. And let's take another one of these runs and let's have you run right at the pace that we think you can do for 5K, just a little bit faster, intervalized. And let's have you also do a little bit of running where you run at your VO2 max pace, and we'll intervalize it so it's not too uncomfortable, right? And if you do that, this run will start getting better and better and better, even though they won't be running any more than they did before. If you also add in the idea of running more and more aerobically, they'll even bigger platform to get better. But just by creating a complex approach where you hit these different limiters, even in the same training stimulus, they'll start to do way better. Mm-hmm. And so, that's the most basic understanding of periodization, really. Bomba talked about all kinds of stuff, but the really significant element from my perspective after a lifetime of doing this is the idea of hitting those various training limiters intelligently.
Yeah, that being said, I know it's probably different for a bunch of people, but what kind of training methods do you train? I mean, what kind of training methods do you dose your elite athletes? Because I've heard of polarization.
So now we have a pretty simplified understanding of this scientifically. It's at least advanced, right? We didn't used to understand this at all. And so now we've created these simplified models, right? So polarized training is the idea of doing a lot of what's called zone 1. This is where it gets complicated. Zone 1 is really below aerobic threshold work, including recovery level work. Doing a lot of zone 1, 80%, and then everything else is basically zone 3, fairly high level work above your anaerobic threshold. Nothing in between, right? And so, the majority of athletes don't actually do that. They include some zone 2 stuff too. I want to talk about what that actually means. So that's in a scientific definition where there's only 3 zones, right? Zone 1, below the aerobic threshold and below. Zone 2, what we call tempo, or in that transition from aerobic threshold to the anaerobic threshold. And then zone 3, anything above anaerobic threshold. However, that's like a very short sight. It's like I'm going to make a salad and I'm going to put 3 things in when I actually have 10 things I can work with, right? It's for people who don't do this for a living, who study it, right? Trying to create models that they can actually use to come up with a conclusion, basically mostly from taking data from people who do it. What we actually do is recognize that every successive increase in the intensity of work represents a limiter to the level below that. Let me explain that statement. So let's say you're this guy who runs 15 miles a week and you run vaguely hard, which means you run kind of in between, in zone 2 basically, right? So you're used to being somewhat uncomfortable and you think a run's not worthwhile unless it's uncomfortable. So one of the things I want to do is have you run a little faster than that. I don't really care if you even run very much. If you just run a little faster than that, all of a sudden you'll get faster, right? Because you take away that limiter of a little higher intensity. A simple way to think about this might be if I could run 400 meters in a minute and I could run 100 meters in, say, 17 seconds, if I can increase my 100 meter speed to 16 seconds, I don't have to do anything other than that, and my 400 meter run time will get faster. It'll now be 57, 58. Because how fast I can run 100 meters, that rate of power is still limiting to anything downstream from it. So to put it into your world, if I also go out and train my squat strength and bring that up, I'll now be able to run 100 meters instead of 17 and 16 without even training to do that, just because I'm stronger. And that'll allow me to run my 400 meters faster, and that'll extend all the way out to, say, an ultramarathon, right? So if I take it even further and I say, okay, I'm not that interested in just my squat strength. I want to see my squat power go up. So I bring that up to, I don't know, 1,800 watts or whatever it is, right, by doing some jump squats, which I've never done before with lighter weight, and I push my power way higher than I can get it, say, using a 5RM type of set. Now I'll be able to run a little faster at each of those successes, because each thing is limiting to the downstream thing that's at a lower power output. So what's interesting is, depending on what you do, the stuff that's way out there at the lower power output also feeds back positively to do this. And here's the way to understand that. Let's say I'm a 100-meter runner and I run this 17 seconds, I'm just mediocre. And my way of training for that is I go out and I run like 6 by 100, right? And I do that, I don't know, once or twice a week, right? So that's all I do. I don't do any other running. So if I go out and actually build some of that lower power endurance, right? Maybe I start running a little bit of easy endurance running. Before you know it, I start being able to do those 6 by 100s more easily. I respond to them better. Now, I don't want to go too far with that, right? I don't want to become an ultra distance runner, because that'll start to negatively impede my ability to keep getting more power. But I do have to have enough endurance to support, or enough training tolerance to support me doing the training that I need to do that's most specific. So, both ends sort of feed back on each other. The real limiters, though, are the high power, right? Like you could take any ultra distance athlete out there who's never done any strength work and give them just a little bit of strength work, and then all of a sudden they can run 400 meters a little faster, and then they'll be running faster in their ultra endurance event without changing how much they run or how much they run aerobically, right? And so the fact that those are all interrelated and understanding how to load all those successfully, that's what I call complex training, right? It's complex because it's involved. You have to hit a complex of, also another way to say it is, you have to hit a complex of different training intensities. So one of the things I like about that the best, from my own perspective, because I've been doing this for like, 30 years, is that it's also way more interesting. When I go out and just run for 15 minutes, that's not very interesting. Even worse, if I do that on a treadmill, it's not very interesting. But if I have to go and do all these elements, this specific warm-up, this specific end-stage warm-up stuff, the specific lead-in set, and then a very specific set, and then some specific work maybe aerobically afterward, where I have to keep changing things, even a treadmill gets interesting to run on because it engages your brain.